If you've ever wondered how the United States won World War II twice, first on the battlefield, then on the balance sheet, this is the part most people never hear. Britain didn't just fight a war in 1940. Britain financed it. And when the money ran out, the price of survival wasn't only paid in blood or rubble. It was paid in assets, bases, trade rules, and decades of dependence. Here's the disturbing question I can't shake. What if the empire that saved civilization was quietly forced into a financial surrender long before the war was even over? You're watching Wealth Rewind, and I'm going to walk through the mechanism like an investigator, not a myth maker, because the mechanics matter, the names matter, the dates matter, and the incentives matter most. In the dark, freezing December of 1940, Britain looked heroic from a distance. The Battle of Britain had been won in the skies, but the Blitz still chewed through neighborhoods at night. London burned. Coventry and Liverpool took pounding after pounding. On a map, the British Empire still looked like a giant, pink spilling across a quarter of the globe. Here's the switch. Inside Whitehall, the men running the government knew something they could not say out loud. Britain wasn't only bleeding soldiers, Britain was bleeding cash. Let me slow that down. Empires don't collapse when they lose territory first. They crack when they can't pay for logistics, fuel, steel, shipping, and imports. And total war is basically the most expensive subscription plan humanity has ever invented, except the bill comes due immediately. Winston Churchill understood that better than anyone. In the underground cabinet war rooms, damp concrete, cigarette smoke, the steady scratch of pens, he sat down to write one of the most consequential letters of his life. It was addressed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Churchill was a master of language, but this wasn't a speech. This was a financial confession dressed up as strategy. The letter was long. It covered the strategic picture, the U-boat peril in the Atlantic, and the desperate need for destroyers and aircraft. But the sting was in the tail. Churchill explained that the moment was approaching when the British Treasury would no longer be able to pay cash for the supplies Britain needed to survive. Britain could fight on beaches and landing grounds, yes, but Britain could not fight without ammunition, and Britain could no longer afford to buy it. Here's the simple version. Churchill was describing insolvency, not in a poetic sense, in the hard sense, the kind that happens when you still have obligations, but the dollars are gone. Now watch what happens when the battlefield meets the ledger. When the war began in September 1939, Britain was still a financial titan. It held billions in gold reserves. It owned overseas investments that threw off income, railroads in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, industrial concerns in the United States. London sat at the center of global insurance and shipping. On paper, it looked safe. In practice, the war Hitler launched didn't behave like old wars. This was a war of machines. Steel, oil, aluminum, rubber, consumed at rates that made pre-war planning look naive. And Britain had a structural weakness that gets ignored in the heroic retelling. Britain had to import almost everything. When continental Europe closed up under blockade and occupation, Britain couldn't just buy from neighbors. Britain had to look across the Atlantic. That's where the trap appears. In 1940, the United States was officially neutral. The American public was deeply isolationist. Memories of the First World War, American boys dying in European mud, still sat in the political bloodstream. Congress had passed neutrality acts designed to keep America out.
And inside those laws was the clause that turned Britain's war into a financial extraction: cash and carry. Cash and carry meant Britain could buy American supplies, but only if Britain paid immediately in cash and transported the goods on British ships. No loans, no credit, no open tab. The United States would sell weapons, yes, but it wanted gold on the barrelhead before the crates left the dock in New York. If that sounds cold, it's because it was. But it also makes sense in American domestic politics. Roosevelt had to live inside that political constraint. He could not look like he was dragging the country into a European war through the back door. Here's the part people miss. Cash and carry turns a military alliance into a liquidity test. Britain wasn't being judged on courage. Britain was being judged on dollars. For the first year of the war, Britain met the test by draining the treasury. Gold reserves were liquidated. Overseas income streams were strained. And then the government did something so dramatic it reads like a heist, except it was legal and it was survival. In a secret operation known as Operation Fish, Britain loaded an enormous portion of the nation's gold and negotiable securities onto ships and rushed it across a U-boat-infested Atlantic to vaults in Canada. It was one of the largest movements of physical wealth in history. Watch the incentive. America could remain neutral, keep its laws intact, and still become the paymaster of the arsenal, because the payments flowed one direction. Britain was selling the past to purchase the present. This is what that means in real life. Imagine your house is under attack, and the only hardware store that sells locks says, cash only, and you pick it up yourself. You don't negotiate philosophy. you start selling whatever you own. By late 1940, the gold was gone. Liquid cash was gone. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington had contracts sitting on desks that it could not sign, not because the need was unclear, but because London told them there were no dollars left to honor the orders. Britain had hit the wall that destroys most institutions, the moment when the decision is no longer what should we buy, but what can we still pay for. Here's a present-day mirror that should feel uncomfortably familiar in America. This is what happens when a system runs on confidence until suddenly it runs on liquidity. When credit cards, mortgages, or funding markets don't care about your story anymore, they only care if the payment clears. Roosevelt received Churchill's letter and understood the stakes. If Britain fell, the United States would be next in the strategic sequence. But he had a political problem. He couldn't simply give Britain money. The laws forbade it, and the public would revolt. He needed a structure that looked like a hard-headed business arrangement, not charity. He needed to sell the war effort to the American taxpayer without using the word gift. This is where the concept of Lend-Lease was born. Publicly, Roosevelt explained it with a folksy analogy. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't haggle over the price of a garden hose. You lend the hose and get it back when the fire is out. It sounded clean, it sounded generous, it sounded like a neighborly act. But here's the quiet part. Behind closed doors in Washington, this was not a conversation between neighbors. This was a negotiation between a creditor and a bankrupt client. And the next question wasn't, how do we help Britain? The question was, how do we make sure Britain has nothing left to hide before America commits to carrying the load? That's the trade. And the man who would enforce it, quietly, relentlessly, was the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr. Henry Morgenthau Jr. wasn't just another cabinet official. Here's the switch. As Treasury Secretary, he sat at the choke point between American politics and Britain's survival. He wanted Hitler defeated, yes,
But he also saw himself as the guardian of the American taxpayer. And in his mind, that meant one thing. Before a single dime of aid, Britain had to prove it was truly tapped out. Let me translate that. In a crisis, the creditor always asks the same question. Show me the balance sheet, not the public story, the actual assets. Morgenthau demanded what the British negotiators experienced as humiliation. He pushed for a full audit of the British Empire, government assets and private British assets anywhere in the world. This wasn't symbolic, it was granular. He wanted to know what Britain owned, what it earned, and what it could sell. What's clear is the leverage had shifted. Britain was no longer negotiating as the banker of the 19th century. Britain was negotiating like a distressed borrower. Now watch what happens when an alliance turns into due diligence. The British team, led by Sir Frederick Phillips, was stunned. They were being asked to open their books to a foreign power. They were not being treated like a partner fighting a shared enemy. They were being treated like a company in receivership. Phillips tried to argue the economics of timing. Britain had already sold gold. Selling long-term investments during wartime would be a fire sale, pennies on the dollar. And if Britain stripped itself of overseas income, the country would emerge from the war unable to feed its population or rebuild shattered cities. On paper, that logic was airtight. In practice, Morgenthau didn't care. The incentive was political. If Britain still had assets, why should an American farmer subsidize British tanks? This is where people get lost. Morgenthau wasn't only thinking like a financier, he was thinking like a politician trying to pass a bill through Congress, while isolationists accused Britain of being secretly rich. The most painful symbol of this forced liquidation was American Viscose Corporation. It was a major industrial giant in the United States, rayon and artificial silk, owned by a British company, Courtaulds. It generated millions of dollars in dividends flowing back to London, helping Britain balance its trade deficit. Here's the quiet part. Morgenthau identified that income stream as a target, not because it was immoral, but because it was liquid. He told the British they had to sell. He wanted the cash deposited in the US Treasury to cover existing weapons orders. Britain resisted. The company was worth over $100 million, and a rushed sale would be financial self-harm. But Morgenthau held the leverage. The Lend-Lease bill was moving through Congress and isolationists were attacking it. Morgenthau needed proof Britain was bleeding, not hiding wealth. That's the trade. Sell the asset or the bill dies. On Sunday, March 15, 1941, under intense pressure from Washington, the British government seized American Viscose through a compulsory purchase order under emergency war powers. They did not ask permission, they took it. The sale was handled by American investment bankers. And because the sale was distressed, because everyone knew Britain had to sell,
Those bankers did what bankers do in a forced liquidation. They drove a merciless bargain. The company sold for roughly $54 million. The British government had to reimburse Courtaulds back in London in pounds, adding internal debt. The dollars went straight into the US Treasury to pay for rifles and aircraft engines. Let me slow that down. Britain didn't sell an American asset to fund its own recovery. Britain sold an American asset to pay America for the tools of survival. This is where the system flips from help to transfer. The sale wasn't just a transaction, it was a turning point in perception. The British elite realized the true price of the special relationship. They were not equals at the negotiating table. They were a junior entity being stripped to keep breathing. The United States was absorbing British imperial wealth, not by conquest but by contract.
Here's a present-day mirror in American terms. This is what happens in modern bailouts and restructurings too. The headlines talk about rescue. The paperwork often looks like collateral. If this kind of mechanism, war on the surface, balance sheet extraction underneath, connects some dots for you, that's exactly why I do these investigations. If you want to keep following the money through history with me, you can subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter when it drums. But it didn't stop with factories and dividends. Now watch what happens when military urgency becomes a bargaining chip. Britain was desperate for destroyers. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than British shipyards could replace them. The lifeline to North America was being cut. Churchill begged Roosevelt for 50 old destroyers, World War I-era ships sitting in American naval yards, rusting and obsolete. Roosevelt agreed. But again, there was a price. He did not give them for free. He traded them. In exchange for 50 aging ships, the United States demanded 99-year leases on a chain of British naval and air bases across the Atlantic: Newfoundland and Canada, the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, British Guiana. Here's the switch. Britain wasn't just buying hardware. Britain was signing away strategic geography. Think about the scale of that trade. Britain handed the United States a footprint across the Western Hemisphere, keys to the Caribbean and the North Atlantic, for ships that were barely seaworthy. It was a geopolitical fire sale. Britain was trading long-term strategic assets for short-term tactical survival. The act of a desperate nation hawking the family silver to buy food. By the time the Lend-Lease Act was signed into law in March 1941, Britain had been stripped clean. The gold was gone. US investments were being sold. Bases were leased. The treasury was empty. Publicly, Lend-Lease was hailed as the arsenal of democracy, a noble act of solidarity. And in many ways it was. It provided tanks, planes, oil, and food that kept Britain alive. Without it, Britain might have been starved into submission. But here's the quiet part again. The aid wasn't a gift. It was a lease. The underlying assumption was that there would be a reckoning. There would be consideration. And buried inside the agreement was a clause that looked like diplomacy but behaved like a poison pill. The text contained Article 7, a small paragraph in dense language that targeted the economic skeleton of the British Empire. It stated that in return for aid, Britain would agree to dismantle its imperial preference system after the war. Imperial preference wasn't a slogan. It was the economic wall holding the empire together, tariffs and trade rules that favored Britain and its colonies, Canada, Australia, India, South Africa, making British goods cheaper inside the imperial markets than American goods. Here's the simple version. Article 7 meant Britain was agreeing to tear down its own defenses and open its empire to American exporters. It was a commitment to dismantle Britain's trading bloc from the inside. The British negotiators fought it. They understood what it meant, but they had no choice. German bombers were overhead. U-boats were in the Atlantic. Cash was gone. They signed. And the moment they signed, the story stopped being only about wartime survival. Because now the next question wasn't whether Britain could endure the Blitz. The next question was what would happen when the war ended, and the creditor finally decided it was time to collect. Once Article 7 was signed, the war kept moving, but the financial geometry had already changed. Now watch what happens when two allies fight the same enemy with two completely different balance sheets. As 1941 turned into 1942, and the United States officially entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Britain and America were finally side by side in uniform terms. American soldiers poured into Britain.
The island became an immense launch pad, an aircraft carrier made of stone and hedgerows for the U.S. Army Air Forces. But the disparity only widened. American industry,
supercharged by government spending, exploded in scale and efficiency. The US economy grew by huge percentages year after year. Britain's economy, meanwhile, was being distorted and cannibalized by the war effort. Britain stopped exporting. It converted factories to war production. It abandoned markets in Latin America and Asia, not because it wanted to, but because it had no spare capacity. Here's the quiet part. Markets don't wait. When Britain stepped back, someone stepped in. American companies did. While British factories made Spitfires, American factories made Spitfires and refrigerators and radios and cars for the global market. The United States was fighting the war while simultaneously expanding its commercial future. Let me slow that down. This is one of the oldest patterns in economic history. When one power is forced to spend every unit of capacity on survival, another power can spend on survival and positioning. In modern terms, it's the difference between a household in crisis selling assets to pay bills and a household with cash buying those assets at a discount. By 1944, the transfer of financial gravity was hard to deny. Gold reserves that once sat in London had shifted across the Atlantic. The center of global finance was moving, quietly, in the direction of the creditor. Britain still had courage and legitimacy, but it was losing the thing that determines influence after war's end: liquidity. The British believed that sacrifice would be honored. They believed that because they had fought alone against Hitler for 2 years, because they had bankrupted themselves to hold the line, the Americans would treat them generously when peace arrived. They believed Lend-Lease would continue for a transition period. They believed there would be a soft landing. They were wrong. Here's the expert lens I keep coming back to. In high finance, gratitude is not a currency. Contracts are. The war ended in August 1945. Japan surrendered. In London, crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Bonfires were lit. Strangers hugged in the streets. It was unfiltered relief. But across the Atlantic in Washington, the mood was not sentimental. It was procedural. And 7 days after the victory celebrations began, President Harry Truman signed a piece of paper that hit Britain harder than many bombs ever could. He terminated Lend-Lease. The cutoff was immediate. Aid stopped. No transition period, no grace period. In the middle of the Atlantic, American Liberty ships carrying wheat, meat, and tools toward Liverpool were ordered to turn around and sail home. The lifeline was severed in real time. That's the trade, and it's hard to overstate the shock. Britain had built its wartime economy around this flow. When it snapped, Britain wasn't facing a future problem. Britain was facing a present-tense cliff. Here's a present-day mirror Americans will recognize. This is the moment when a funding line is pulled, when the credit card issuer says no, when a lender refuses to roll the debt. The system doesn't gradually adjust, it stops, then it panics. John Maynard Keynes looked at the numbers and saw what he called an abyss. Britain imported half its food and almost all its raw materials. During the war, those imports were effectively financed through the Lend-Lease arrangement. Without those dollars, Britain was bankrupt, not in a year, not in a month, but instantly. Keynes calculated Britain faced a financial Dunkirk, default risk, a collapse in imports, rations cut towards starvation levels, industries with no inputs, and the threat of mass unemployment and social breakdown. There was only one option. Britain had to beg. In September 1945, a sick and exhausted Keynes boarded a ship for Washington with a moral argument. Britain had fought alone while America remained neutral. Britain had spent blood and treasure to save Western civilization. Therefore, the United States should give Britain a grant, $6 billion, not a loan, but justice, retroactive payment for holding the line. But when Keynes arrived, he found the political mood had shifted. The war was over. The American public was tired of paying for Europe. Congress was suspicious of Britain's new Labour government and its platform of socialism and nationalization. American negotiators, led by Fred Vinson, were blunt. There would be no gift. There would be no grant. There would only be a loan, on commercial terms, with interest. Keynes argued. He warned them that crushing Britain would weaken a vital ally against the rising Soviet threat. But the Americans held the cards. They offered $3.75 billion, barely enough to survive, and they attached conditions designed to reshape Britain's remaining economic independence. The most poisonous condition was sterling convertibility. Within 1 year, Britain had to make the pound fully convertible. That meant anyone holding pounds could walk into a bank and exchange them for US dollars. Framed as free trade, it sounded principled. In practice, it was a weapon against the sterling area. This is what that means in real life. During the war, Britain forced many colonies and partners to accept payments in pounds while restricting conversion into dollars. That created a closed loop that protected British industry. The Americans wanted to smash the loop. They knew that if convertibility became real, holders of sterling would rush to swap it for dollars because the world wanted American goods and American industry could supply them. Keynes saw the trap. He predicted a run on the pound that would drain the loan quickly. He fought until his health broke, but the alternative was starvation. Parliament accepted the loan in July 1946. Keynes died a few months later. Then came the winter of 1947, the coldest in living memory. Blizzards, frozen coal stockpiles, power stations shutting down, factories closing, families lighting candles in unheated homes because there was no electricity. Bread, never rationed even in the darkest war years, was rationed in peacetime. The victory felt like austerity. And then the American condition arrived on schedule. On July 15, 1947, Britain made sterling convertible. The result was exactly what Keynes predicted. The moment the window opened, the world rushed to sell pounds for dollars. In just 1 month, Britain lost hundreds of millions of dollars. The hemorrhage was so violent, the government watched reserves vanish. After 5 weeks, on August 20, 1947, Britain suspended convertibility. They slammed the window shut and went back to the US Treasury to admit failure. Now watch what happens when finance becomes geopolitics. Britain's weakness had immediate consequences. In February 1947, Britain sent a secret telegram to the US State Department. Britain could no longer afford to support Greece and Turkey against communist pressure. In plain language, Britain was saying, "We're broke, we're leaving. If you want to stop this, you do it." That message triggered the Truman Doctrine. The baton of world power wasn't ceremonially handed over, it was dropped because Britain couldn't pay to hold it. In 1949, Britain devalued the pound. Before the war, it had been $4.86. It was cut to $2.80. Overnight, Britons became roughly 30% poorer relative to the dollar world. Imports became more expensive. The cost of living rose. It was an admission that Britain was no longer competitive on the old terms. But the final bill didn't end in the 1940s. The Anglo-American Loan of 1946 wasn't a gift, it was debt with interest. Every year for decades, the British Treasury wrote checks to the US Treasury. Through the boom of the 1950s, the gloom of the 1970s, the Thatcher years, the Blair years, the payments continued. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006.
60 years after the guns fell silent, British taxpayers were still paying for the privilege of having survived. Here's the closing lesson I keep coming back to. In the modern era, total war is a negative-sum game. Germany lost and was destroyed. Britain won and was bankrupted. The only true winner was the United States, an economy that doubled in size, held much of the world's gold, and used Lend-Lease and post-war loans to pry open the imperial trading system and absorb assets and influence through contracts. Britain didn't simply decline. It was liquidated, piece by piece, under the logic of survival financing. When Churchill wrote to Roosevelt in December 1940, he likely saved his country from Hitler. But he also began a transaction that traded an empire for time. There was no other choice. That's what makes it tragic, and that's what makes it useful to study, especially now, when Americans are once again living in a world of debt ceilings, fragile supply chains, and systems that look stable until the funding stops. If you want more investigations like this, where I follow the incentives and the paperwork, not just the speeches, that's what I'm building on Wealth Rewind. Subscribe if you want the next story like this to find you.